This is our last section for the first unit of pre-cal, and it is more about factoring. There's several things we did over the last couple years in algebra that you need to be reminded of, because factoring is critical in doing some of the work that we'll do. Alright, looking at the first one here, where we factor the following. Let me get a mouse going, hopefully, and a pen. There we go. Try that pen right there. Okay, for x squared plus 9x minus 10, we're going to see if we can factor that. Well, we see first, again, check to see if it's a perfect square. Can you take the square root of the x squared? Yes. Can you take the square root of 10? No, you can't. So we'll see what we can do in terms of factoring. We know we can't use the perfect square method, so we're going to check our second sign. It's negative. That means one of these factors is going to be positive and one is going to be negative. The first term in each factor is going to be an x. And then we need factors that will multiply to be negative 10 and add to be positive 9. Well, that would be, they're both we have 10 can be 10 times 1, 5 times 2. Okay, that's it for 10s. Well, 10 and one is positive and one is negative. So positive 10 times a negative 1 would give us negative 10, and 10 minus 1 is going to give us 9. So 10 and negative 1 are our two numbers. The 10 is the positive factor, and the 1 will be the negative factor. And so that's the answer of how to factor that particular trinomial. Looking at the next one, same thing. Second sign is a negative. It's got a coefficient of 1. So we know that y is our first term. We're going to have y plus and y minus. Factors that multiply to be, I'm going to put an m here, multiply to be negative 35 and add to be negative 2. Well, 7 and 5 will do that. Which one's negative? Since this 2 is negative, it's going to be negative 7 and positive 5. Multiply those two together, you get negative 35. Add them together, you get negative 2. So this would be our factorization right here. Okay. Next one, example C, same thing. It's not a perfect square. So let's look. We have n and we have n. Alright. Now we need things that will multiply to be 15, add to be negative 8. This second sign here is positive, and the first sign is negative. This tells me both signs are the same. This tells me both signs are negative. So I'm going to put a minus in each of these factors. Okay, multiply to be 15, add to be negative 8. That would be 5, negative 5, and negative 3. Alright, let's look at D. We can take the square root of each end of this. The square root of x to the fourth is x squared. And the square root of 4, negative 4, well, we can't take the square root of negative 4 because the square root can't be negative. Excuse me, I overlooked that little important fact. So let's go back. I'm trying to hit the erase button. There we go. Alright, so square root of x to the fourth is x squared. That's a little tricky. Okay. And we need factors that will multiply to be negative 4 and add to be negative 3. Multiply to be negative 4 and add to be negative 3. Alright, so this is going to be one of each sign. Okay. So here we have the two numbers we're going to use will be -4 and +1. That would multiply to be -4 and add to be -3. So we have -4 and +1. Now the thing you have to do once you factor, check your factors. If they're not linear, which means the highest power of the variable is to the first, you have to see if you can factor any more in any of the factors. Well, we can take the square root of x squared in 1, but there's a plus sign here, so we can't, that's not a difference of squares. We can't factor that one anymore. But look at this second factor. We can take the square root of x squared, that's x. We can take the square root of 4, that's 2. And there's a minus sign in between, so it's a difference of squares. So this is going to factor even more to be x squared plus 1. Remember, we can't do anything with that one. But the x squared minus 4 is going to become x minus 2 times x plus 2. Okay. So you have to continue factoring. This is one thing a lot of students tend not to do, is continue factoring until you're done. Alright, factor a polynomial with 4 terms. First, factor out the GCF. So let's look at this one. There isn't a GCF that I can see. So it's going to stay 3x cubed plus 6x squared plus 4x plus 8, because there's no GCF in this particular problem. Okay. Step 2, make 2 groups of binomials that have common factors. Alright, so 3 and 6 have a common factor, so we're going to group them. 3x cubed plus 6x squared and plus 4x plus 8. Now grouping doesn't change. When you're adding, you can add in any order. Group them in any way you want. So that putting those parentheses in there does not change this at all. This is expression. Now we're going to factor out the GCF from each of the sets of parentheses. And we grouped them because we wanted them to have common factors. So this greatest common factor of the first set of parentheses here is a 3x. And when we divide each of those by 3x, we're left with x plus 3x squared, excuse me, is our greatest common factor. We're left with x plus 2. Alright, plus our second greatest common factor for the second set of parentheses is a 4. And that leaves me with x plus 2. Now we have to factor out the common binomial. If you think of this grouped together, and this is the hardest thing to, this is also now grouped together as 2 terms. Even though there's multiplication there, it's 2 terms. It's a binomial. Okay, this whole thing. So the common factor that these 2 terms have is x plus 2. So we're going to factor out the x plus 2. And when we do that, that means we divide each of these terms by x plus 2. Okay, so we factored out our x plus 2, and it's written in front. What's left then is 3x squared plus 4. Okay, and so that would be the factorization for this polynomial that had 4 terms that we started with. Alright, if you could factor this quadratic term here further, then you need to, but we can't. Okay, looking at this next one again, there are 4 terms, so the first thing we're going to do is group them. That should be parentheses y minus 5. Alright, factor the greatest common factor out of the first term, which is y squared. And we're left with y minus 5. Now, if there's nothing in front here, there's a 1. There's no greatest common factor. I'm going to write a 1 there just because it helps you see what your factorization is going to be. Now, again, this is a binomial. This is the first term, and this is the second term. We factor out the y minus 5 from this binomial. And the term that we're left with when we divide, just like we did in step 3 right up above, is y squared plus 1. And you're done. Again, if this was a minus, we would have to factor it further as a difference of squares, but with a plus, there's nothing you can do. You leave it just as it is. Alright, let's group this example 3. We have 4x cubed minus 6x squared, that's a group, plus 10x, whoops, 10, well, maybe the eraser would be a better idea. Okay, 10x minus 15. Okay, that's your second term, second group. Alright, factor the common factor here is going to be 2x squared. And that leaves us with 2x minus 3. Plus, we're going to factor out a 5 from this second group, and that leaves us with 2x minus 3. Now, this is a binomial expression now. We factor out the 2x minus 3. Now, you don't have to put those brackets around there. The only reason I'm putting them there is so that you can see that it is a binomial, because sometimes this last little step confuses some people. Alright, so we have 2x minus 3 is one term once we factor that greatest common factor out there, and 2x squared plus 5 is our second factor. So that is the factorization of this example 3. Okay, let's move to the next page. Now, what if you have a lead coefficient other than 1? And that's a little tricky, so here are the steps for that. Multiply the first and last terms together. So that's 2x squared times negative 21 is negative 42x squared. Alright, find the factors that will multiply to give you negative 42x squared and add to give you negative 1x. Negative 1x is the middle term. This right here is the middle term. That's where that came from. So, we need factors that will multiply to be negative 42x squared. Well, think of the factors of 42. One of them is 7 times 6. Okay? They need to add to be negative 1x. Negative 42x squared. Well, say it, write something different. Y'all know I'm famous for that. Okay. Negative 42x squared, add to be negative 1x. Okay. So we've got our numbers, but to get x squared, this has to be 7x and 6x. Okay. That's going to multiply to be negative 42x squared. 1 is going to have to be negative. Now, to get a negative 1x, it's the 7 that will have to be negative. We'd have negative 7x plus 6x. That will give us negative 1x. So those are the two terms that we need. Now we're going to rewrite the middle term. Instead of negative 1x, we're going to write it using those two factors. So we're going to write 2x squared, okay, plus 6x, and you can write, actually I usually write the negative term first if one of them's negative, and the reason for that is I'm going to show you why. But I'm going to go ahead and write plus 6x, now minus 7x, and then minus 21. The reason is when we group them, We need to group that negative in with the 7. And if we do that, often it looks like we've already got two factors. So when I have a negative term here, I advise, this is my strategy, to write plus a negative. So write plus a negative 7x, so that you know that these are two, this is just a grouped expression rather than a factored expression. It doesn't look like you've already got your two factors. And then you know that the negative 7 is in there with the negative is in there with the 7x. Okay, now factor out the greatest common factor. You have 2x. And that's going to leave you with x plus 3. Now on this one, what I factor out is a negative 7. Go ahead, now you don't have to write the plus because that negative is there. Negative 7, and that will leave me with x plus 3. Remember, that sign's got to change when you factor out that negative, because this has to multiply back to give you negative 7x minus 21. Now we've got a binomial here and here, and we're going to factor by grouping. Well, I already factored by grouping. I read the head. Anyway, I wrote in the middle term, and then I went ahead and grouped and factored it by grouping. Now we're going to pull out our greatest common factor, which is x plus 3. And the other factor then is 2x minus 7. And we don't have to, once you have factorization that's all linear factors, you really don't have to worry to see if you could factor any more. But what you probably ought to do is double check, multiply that expression to be sure you get to the first expression, or the one you started with. Alright, so here's four more examples. That one was step by step, these are not. Okay, multiply. We have 3 times negative 8, so that's negative 24x squared. I'm going to write it kind of out here to the side. It has to add to be negative 10x. Okay, so what two factors would multiply to be 24, add to be negative 10? We know that they're going to be 1 because this is negative. This multiplication one is negative. It's going to be a plus and a minus factor, one of each sign. So I would say we're looking at 12x and 2x. And the one that has to be negative is the negative 12x. So these are our two factors that we're going to split for this middle term. So we're going to split the middle term. We have 3x squared minus 12x. Again, I like to just go ahead and put the negative term with the first element if I can. Alright, now we have negative 12x plus 2x minus 8. We're going to group them. Factor out the greatest common factor, which in this case is 3x, and that leaves us with x minus 4. Plus, we're going to factor out a 2, which leaves us with x minus 4. So now we factor x minus 4 out of that binomial, and our factorization then is x minus 4 times 3x plus 2. Okay. Alright, multiply these two together. This is very similar to the, in a way as far as the factors, to the one in the example. We have a negative 42x squared. But now we need it to be a positive 1x when we add them. So our factors are going to be 6x and 7x again. But now the 6x is negative because we want it to be a positive x. So we're going to put our negative with our first term, since there's one of each. So we have 6x squared minus 6x plus 7x minus 7. Group them. Then we factor out a 6x, and that leaves us with x minus 1. Here we factor out a 7, and that leaves us with x minus 1. And so now we have factor out the x minus 1 from the binomial. So we have x minus 1 times 6x plus 7. Okay. Looking at example 7, multiply 6 times negative 20. We get negative 120 x squared. And they need to add to be 7x. Okay. So this can be, we're going to have to think of some things, and I don't have my key right in front of me, so I'm going to have to think about it. We've got 120 times 2. Let's list them, because this is the process you're going to have to go through, if you don't know. So we can have 1 times 120, which is obviously not going to get it for us. We need to get a 7. 2 times 60. 3 times 40. 4 times 30. Okay. 5. Now some of you will be able to see this easily, and some of you will maybe not be able to see it as easily. 6. 6 times 20, the difference of those, remember we're going to take the difference between these because this 120 is minus. The difference here is 14, so we're getting a little closer. We also have 10 times 12, but that's going to be 2. Okay. So we have 8 times 15. Okay. So see, I wasn't sure about the 8 factor, but I did know that 10 times 12, and we find that our differences are getting smaller, smaller, smaller. 10 times 12, the difference is too small, so I went back instead of continuing on. So we're going to use 8x and 15x, and it's positive, so the 8 is going to be the negative term. So let's erase all this work that I did here to discover the factors. And sometimes you're going to have to do that. If it's a very large number or not something you necessarily know all the factors to, you're going to have to work it through. Alright, so now we can split the terms. The middle term, we have 6x squared minus 8x plus 15x and minus 20. And remember, we get this because it adds up to give us the middle term. We haven't changed anything. We've just rewritten it with 2 terms instead of 1. That allows us to group and discover the factorization a little easier. This is a really important skill when you don't have the coefficient of 1. You use this or the quadratic formula or trial and error, and this kind of eliminates trial and error. Okay, so we've got a factor of 2x, and that leaves us with 3x minus 4 plus, and the factor, greatest common factor here is a 5, which will leave us with 3x minus 4. So we're going to factor out of this binomial a 3x minus 4, and that leaves us with our other factor being 2x plus 5. And this would have been a hard one to test and guess over, I think. But, maybe not. Some of you see math very easily. Some of you struggle, and that's just a fact. And so those of you that struggle, you have to work things through and maybe take a little longer. All right, middle term, we multiply these. We have 6x squared is our the end terms multiplied together. We need it to be negative 5x. We need to add to be negative 5x. And it's funny that this is the factorization that a lot of people forget, is the 1 multiplied by 1. And 6, they'll say, oh my gosh, or well, actually this is not that one, but sometimes 6 times 1 they'll say, oh, I don't know, what could that be? It doesn't make sense to me. remember, one of the factors of anything is multiplied by that number multiplied by 1. This case, though, I was thinking it was that. But we don't subtract them because you have to notice here, again, this is important to notice, the second sign is positive. That means both our terms are going to be negative, so we're going to add them together, not subtract them like we've been doing in these other 3 examples. So in this case, it's going to be negative 2 times plus negative 3 will give us the 5x. Negative 2 times negative 3 is going to give us the positive 6x squared. So if this term right here is positive, remember that your signs are the same. If it's negative, like it was in these other 3 examples, your signs are going to be different on those factors that you discover to split that middle term. Okay, so we're going to have 2x squared minus 2x. Now, again, when you have the second part of the middle term, we don't have a choice. One of them has to be negative. I would write it as plus negative 3x and then plus 3. That way, when you group them, you don't forget to group that negative in the parentheses. Factor out a 2 here, and that's going to be x squared, 2x, x squared minus 1. Factor here a negative 3. Let's start that over again. I get ahead of myself sometimes. We're going to factor out a 2x. So that leaves me with x minus 1. I know somebody out there was saying, Miss Speck, that's wrong. And then we're going to have our minus. We're going to factor out a negative. So we're going to factor out a negative 3, which is going to leave me with x minus 1. Now when we factor out x minus 1, the other factor we discover is 2x minus 3. Okay? And so there we are. And that's how you factor by grouping. You need to print out the review and work on that. We'll have a test coming up.